Wapping High Street, London, late September 1935, mid-afternoon. Station Officer Albert Coyle, 43, London Fire Brigade, 11 years working the riverside stations of the Eastern District, was reading the smoke off the roofline of an 8-story bonded warehouse before his crew had the first line run out. The building was Colonial Wharf. It held crude rubber, floor upon floor of it, and Coyle had attended 2 rubber fires before this one, neither of them in a building this tall, neither of them this close to the water. The call had come to Whitechapel Station by exchange telephone a few minutes past 3:30. A second call from a passerby on the South Bank had reached the fire float crew at Cherry Garden Pier almost as fast. That was the first thing the building was telling Coyle before he had climbed down from the appliance. This was not a fire that land engines alone were going to reach. Wapping High Street ran narrow and close-packed along the North Bank. Warehouse walls rising straight from the pavement with barely room for a pump to stand. The only open approach to the seat of this fire was the river itself. Coyle had 11 years of reading buildings like this one. What the roofline smoke told him, pale, fast-moving, climbing rather than rolling, was that the fire had already worked up through several floors before anyone on the street had seen it. Rubber did not announce itself the way cotton dust did. It built heat quietly inside stacked bales, and by the time smoke reached a window, it had usually been alight for longer than the call time suggested. He had learned that on his first rubber warehouse fire 4 years earlier, when what looked like a contained blaze on arrival had gone to 4 floors within the hour. What Coyle did not yet know, in the first minutes on Wapping High Street, was how long this particular fire had already been running before anyone called it in, and what that unknown number of minutes was going to mean for the buildings on either side of Colonial Wharf, and for the fire float crew now crossing the Thames toward him. The Dennis pumping appliance that Coyle's crew had brought to Wapping High Street carried a turbine pump rated to deliver up to 700 gallons a minute. The standard specification the London Fire Brigade had been running through the 1930s. On a street fire in a building with normal hydrant access, 700 gallons a minute was a serious amount of water. On Colonial Wharf, with the seat already established on an upper floor and the warehouse packed floor to ceiling with rubber, it was a fraction of what the fire was going to need, and Coyle knew it before the first jet went up. What the Dennis pump could not do was solve the access problem. Wapping High Street gave land crews one narrow approach and hydrant pressure that dropped fast once more than 2 or 3 appliances were drawing from the same main. The building's real water supply, the one that mattered for a fire of this size, was the river running past its back wall. That was what the fire float existed for. Beta 3, Merryweather built, rated at 2,000 gallons a minute, could moor directly against the dock wall and draw an effectively unlimited supply straight from the Thames, bypassing every hydrant limitation the street presented. Within the hour, a second and larger fire float would be needed, and London's newest, Massey Shaw, launched from Cowes only months earlier and capable of 3,000 gallons a minute from her twin Merryweather pumps, represented the next generation of exactly this capability. A floating pump that did not depend on the mains at all. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the British Fire Brigade between 1900 and 1980. The appliance, the building, the knowledge that the officer had built from previous attendances, and the community that depended on that knowledge before smoke detectors and sprinklers changed what fire could do before the crew arrived. Not spectacle. The documented operational intelligence of a fire brigade that protected a working port built from warehouse stock that burned in specific ways that specific people had learned to read. What did 11 years of Wapping and Rotherhithe warehouse fires give Station Officer Coyle that the Dennis pump's 700-gallon rating and the brigade training manual had not supplied? And what happened to that knowledge when the docks that had built it closed in 1969? And if you or your family served with the London Fire Brigade, the National Fire Service, or the Port of London Authority around the docks in this period, put it in the comments. What building, what warehouse, what watch do you remember? And what did the older hands teach you about how the river fires were different from the street fires? The next video in this series follows the Millwall and Poplar divisions through the Blitz nights that came after Surrey Docks. What the NFS learned about fighting fire in a burning port with the tide against them. Back at the appliance, Coyle had not been taught in any brigade manual how crude rubber behaved on the 4th floor of an 8-story Wapping warehouse specifically. He had been taught fire behavior in general terms, how heat built inside stacked combustible stock, how smoke color and density told you what stage of a fire you were looking at, how a building's construction determined whether that fire stayed contained or found a way through the floors. What 11 years on the Eastern River stations had given him was the specific application of that general training to this stretch of the Thames, to warehouses built wall-to-wall along a working port, packed with commodities that did not burn the way a terraced house or a cotton mill burned. Rubber warehouses were, in Coyle's experience, among the worst buildings in London to fight fire in. Crude rubber burned with a thick, oily black smoke that obscured visibility fast and carried intense, radiant heat well beyond the seat of the fire. Heat that could ignite adjoining stock through a party wall before a flame had physically crossed it. He had watched that happen once already, at a smaller rubber store near the same stretch of wharves, and it had taught him to treat every adjoining warehouse as a second fire from the moment the first jet went up. Not as a building to be protected only if time allowed. What Colonial Wharf was telling him in the first quarter hour was that this fire had already crossed into the adjoining rubber-stocked warehouse to the east before his crew had even confirmed the seat on the original building. That was not a failure of response time. It was what rubber did at this scale, in buildings of this age and this proximity. And it meant the operation was no longer about extinguishing one warehouse. It was about deciding, with the water available, which buildings on this stretch of Wapping High Street could still be saved and which could not. By the time the fire at Colonial Wharf was declared surrounded, close to 10 o'clock that night, 60 pumps had been called to Wapping High Street. Appliances relieved in shifts, as crews who had been on continuous duty for hours were sent back to rest and replaced. Surrounded did not mean out. The warehouse continued to burn fiercely through the lower floors overnight, walls weakening as the fire consumed the structure from within. And what Coyle and the other officers on scene now had to read was not the fire itself, but the building's own structural failure in progress. Early the next morning, part of the front wall came down into Wapping High Street. Shortly afterward, a violent explosion. Trapped gas or vapor from the burning rubber finding an ignition point within the collapsing structure brought down a side wall as well. This was the specific danger that 11 years of river station experience had taught Coyle to expect from a building burning at this intensity for this long. Not a single collapse, but a sequence of them, each one changing where a crew could safely stand and where a hose line could safely be run. The fire burned for 4 days in total. Liquid rubber melted from the burning stock ran from the ruined warehouse into the street. The roof, with a loading crane mounted on it, eventually gave way entirely. The crane from which firemen had been directing jets only hours before, crashing down onto barges moored in the river below, and sinking 3 of them. The district around Wapping High Street was left blanketed in soot. Nearby schools and tenements were for a time unfit to be lived in. What this incident taught Coyle, and what he carried into every dock warehouse fire he attended afterward, was that a fire of this scale in this kind of building was never a single operational problem with a single ending. It was a sequence of separate changing hazards: structural collapse, explosion, falling plant, burning liquid stock that could not be predicted from the smoke column alone, only from having stood close enough to buildings like it for long enough to know what they eventually did. 5 years after Colonial Wharf, on the afternoon of September 7th, 1940, the first daylight raid of the London Blitz fell directly on the Surrey commercial docks. This was the same category of building stock Coyle had spent a career reading. Timber-floored, commodity-packed dock warehouses built close together along limited access roads, except now there was no single seat of fire to locate. High Explosive had opened dozens of seats simultaneously across roughly 250 acres of Dockland. And the officers on the ground that afternoon were applying the same building knowledge Coyle had built at Colonial Wharf to a problem an order of magnitude larger. The docks burned end to end for a week. Roughly a third of the warehouses and transit sheds were destroyed. Crews from London and from brigades as far away as Bristol fought more than 40 separate fires across the site. And the largest single fire, fed by timber stacked in the open ponds that gave the docks their trade, required some 300 pumps on its own. This was the fire behaviour Coyle's generation had learned in pieces. At Colonial Wharf and at warehouses like the #1 warehouse fire at Greenland Dock 4 years earlier, now compressed into a single afternoon and multiplied across an entire port. The same afternoon, across the river at the Royal Victoria Dock, bombs struck the Millennium Mill, a flour warehouse whose automatic sprinkler installation existed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of loss. The sprinklers did not fire. The turbine house and engine room supplying them had been knocked out by the same raid, and the mill's screen room, flour store, loading shed, and warehouse burned for 3 to 4 days regardless. It was, for firefighters who had spent a career learning to read unsprinklered dock buildings, a hard lesson in what a modern fire prevention system was actually worth once its own power supply became part of the target. None of what Coyle read from the appliance mattered to the people standing behind the police cordon on Wapping High Street the way it mattered to him. What mattered to them was simpler and more direct. That building held someone's livelihood, and the fire tearing through it was tearing through work that would not exist the following Monday. Dock work in this stretch of London ran on daily hiring at the warehouse gates. And a warehouse destroyed was not an abstraction to the men who worked it. It was a specific, immediate loss of the place they would have queued outside the next morning. Longshoremen and warehousemen who had spent the afternoon loading and unloading cargo a street away stood and watched Colonial Wharf burn with a stake in the outcome that went beyond curiosity. Families in the tenement housing, packed in behind the wharves, heard the fire bells and came out not knowing yet whether it was close enough to reach their own street or whether a husband or son working a late shift nearby was anywhere near the building. Newspaper reporters were on scene within the hour, and what they wrote in the days that followed carried the fire beyond Wapping to readers across London who had never seen the building and never would. For a community built entirely around the docks, a warehouse fire of this scale was not simply a spectacle to be reported. It was a direct threat to the economic base the whole neighbourhood depended on, and the crowd at the cordon watched Coyle's crews with the specific, invested attention of people whose next month's wages were, in a very literal sense, on fire in front of them. A warehouse fire on the London docks was never only a building fire. Behind every stack of crude rubber, every timber pile, every sack of grain in these warehouses sat a chain of ownership, sale, and insurance that ran from the ship that had carried it to the underwriters at Lloyd's of London, who had priced the risk of exactly this kind of loss. When Colonial Wharf burned, the newspapers did not report only a fire. They reported the destruction of stock that had already been sold, already assigned, already insured, with a specific and calculable financial value attached to every floor that went. London's docks in this period handled a substantial share of everything the country imported, and a major warehouse fire could disrupt that flow for days afterward. Cargo diverted to other wharves, ships delayed at anchor, buyers and sellers renegotiating contracts around goods that no longer existed. This was the layer of significance that sat above the dock workers watching from the cordon. An economic disruption that reached from Wapping High Street into the trading houses of the City of London within hours of the alarm being raised. It was this economic weight, as much as the physical danger, that shaped how seriously London's fire authorities and the Port of London Authority treated dock warehouse fire risk through this period. 60 pumps at Colonial Wharf, 300 at the worst of the Surrey Docks fire, were not simply proportionate to the physical size of the buildings involved. They were proportionate to what burned inside them, and to what a port that stopped functioning, even briefly, meant for the city built around it. The knowledge Coyle built at Colonial Wharf, and that officers across the Eastern District applied again at Surrey Docks in 1940, was knowledge built for a specific set of limitations. Hydrant pressure that dropped fast, hose relays that took time to establish, and communication between land crews and river crews that depended on runners and shouted instructions across open water. Over the following 2 decades, some of those limitations were engineered away. The National Fire Service, formed in 1941, brought the Thames River Formation, the unified command of London's fireboats, into the war years equipped with radio, among the first firefighting units in London to have it. A fireboat working a dock fire no longer had to signal blind to the crews on shore. Breathing apparatus provision expanded through the same period, with the lighter Sieber Gorman Salver set, supplementing the standard proto sets, carried into buildings full of unknown and often toxic combustion products. By the late 1950s, the definitive Proto Mark V set was standard issue, 3 to a pump, on every appliance in London. Foam equipment suited specifically to fires involving spirits, oils, and other flammable liquids stored in bonded sections of the docks became a standard part of the brigade's dock area provision across these same post-war decades, a direct answer to a category of fire that water alone had never handled well. None of this changed the fundamental geography that had made Wapping High Street dangerous in 1935. Narrow streets, warehouse walls rising straight from the pavement, limited approach. What it changed was how fast a crew could get sufficient water and sufficient information onto that geography once a fire had already started. Closing, incrementally, the gap between what a Dennis pump alone could deliver in 1935 and what a fire in a dock warehouse actually needed. The building stock that had given Coyle's generation its specific knowledge did not survive much beyond the period this channel documents. Shipping moved to container transport through the 1960s, and the older enclosed docks, built for sailing ships and breakbulk cargo, not for the scale of a modern container vessel, could no longer accommodate the trade that had once justified their fire cover. The Surrey commercial docks closed to shipping in 1969. The Grand Surrey Canal that had linked them inland closed 2 years later and was drained and filled. Warehousing across large sections of the old dock estate was demolished through the 1970s, and by 1981, the government had established the London Docklands Development Corporation specifically to redevelop what remained derelict. What the redevelopment gave London was, in fire safety terms, an improvement that Coyle would have recognised as genuine. Modern industrial and commercial premises, built to updated construction standards, with automatic detection designed in from the start rather than retrofitted as an afterthought and dependent on a power supply that a bombing raid could sever. What it removed was the specific building stock, the 8-story bonded warehouses, the timber ponds, the narrow riverside streets with a single approach, that had taught firefighters like Coyle what a rubber fire did on an upper floor, what a warehouse wall did after 4 days of burning, and what 300 pumps at Surrey Docks in 1940 had been required to hold. The new buildings did not produce the fires that had built that knowledge. They were not designed to. That was, in the most literal sense, the entire point of the regulations and the redevelopment that followed them. Station Officer Albert Coyle's career, as documented for this composite record, ran from the pre-motorized river stations of the early 1920s through into the post-war reorganization of the London Fire Brigade. A career that began reading rubber warehouses on Wapping High Street with a Dennis pump and a fire float rated at 2,000 gallons a minute, and ended in a London Fire Brigade equipped with radio-linked fireboats, foam tenders, and Proto Mark V breathing apparatus on every pump. If this channel is going to keep documenting what British firefighters knew about the buildings they entered and what that knowledge cost to acquire, subscribe. There are more warehouses, more fireboats, more watch systems, more smoke columns read from a dock wall at 3:30 in the afternoon, and more 4-day fires that taught officers what a rubber warehouse did once it had a hold of a building. Knowledge that was never written down anywhere and that kept the buildings either side of Colonial Wharf standing in 1935. What did 11 years of Wapping and Rotherhithe warehouse fires give Station Officer Coyle that the Dennis pump's 700-gallon rating and the brigade training manual had not supplied? The specific knowledge of how these particular buildings failed, and what happened to that knowledge when the docks that had built it closed for good. And if you have an incident, a station, a watch, a warehouse, Put it in the comments. If you or your family served with the London Fire Brigade, the National Fire Service, or the Port of London Authority around the docks between 1900 and 1960, tell us what you remember. The next video in this series follows the Millwall and Poplar divisions through the Blitz nights that came after Surrey Docks. The Surrey commercial docks closed to shipping in 1969. Station officer Albert Coyle's generation had retired by then. What the redevelopment gave the Docklands: fire-resistant construction, automatic detection, buildings no longer dependent on a single narrow street for their only access. What it removed: the warehouses that had taught them what these buildings did. The development plans did not ask what they knew. The buildings took it with them when they came down. The Surrey commercial docks closed to shipping in 1969. The last of the old bonded warehouse stock along Wapping High Street and the surrounding riverside was cleared through the 1970s. The London Docklands Development Corporation, established in 1981, built modern commercial premises where the timber ponds and dock sheds had stood. What the redevelopment gave the Docklands: fire-resistant construction, automatic detection engineered in from the start, buildings that no longer depended on a single narrow street for their only fire appliance access. What it removed: the 8-story colonial wharf that had taught a generation of officers what crude rubber did on an upper floor across 4 days of burning, the timber ponds that had taught the same generation what 300 pumps could and could not hold across a week-long dock fire, and the specific, hard-won knowledge of how these particular buildings failed, structurally, sequentially, unpredictably, that no training manual had ever been asked to record, because no training manual could have anticipated it. That knowledge lived in officers who had stood close enough to Colonial Wharf and to Surrey Docks in September 1940 to watch it happen. The new buildings did not produce the fires that had built that knowledge. They did not need to. That was the point. The knowledge went with the officers who retired. The buildings went when the demolition crews and later the redevelopment plans arrived. Nobody had asked either of them to leave anything behind.